Well, good morning, church. I hope you're doing well, and I would like to welcome you to what I hope is the last of our video sermons. Our plan is to be back together next week for worship at our regular time, 11 o'clock at Addington Baptist Church, and so I'm looking forward to that. We're going to pay attention to the numbers this week for COVID infections and see what happens as things begin to go back to normal or some semblance of normal anyway. Things begin to open, businesses begin to open up and whatnot. We're going to see how that goes and hopefully be able to meet together next week. We will not, however, be doing Sunday school yet, and there won't be breakfast. Just as a precaution to help us with maintaining social distance and things like that. We'll also ask that you social distance in the sanctuary while you're there. If you are in the high risk category, we suggest that you stay home. It's not that we don't want to see you. I certainly do. But we also don't want to, take unnecessary risks. And so, having said that, I know that most of you are going to ignore that. And if we're having church, you're going to be there. And so, wear your mask if you've got one. If you don't have one and you need one, let us know, and I'm sure we can arrange something. We can get that taken care of. And I'm very much looking forward to being together again and getting to see each other, even if we can't shake hands and hug necks. So that's the plan for next Sunday. As of now, if that changes, we'll let you know. But that's what we're looking at for right now. This morning, I want us to look at Nehemiah. The story of Nehemiah is one of my favorites in definitely all of the Old Testament. Nehemiah was a prophet that had kind of started his life in exile, and word came back to him that his home city, the city of Jerusalem, the walls were destroyed, and the city was in bad shape and in disrepair. And so Nehemiah goes to the king and God gives him favor with the king, and Nehemiah asks for permission to go back to Jerusalem and survey the damage and begin the process of rebuilding the walls around Israel for its protection. Because of God's protection and because God provided favor with the king not only gave Nehemiah permission to go back, but he sent him back with people and with building materials. And so Nehemiah gets back to the city. It's worse than he's heard. The walls are in terrible shape. The city is just open to attack from anybody that would want to attack it. And so Nehemiah sets the work of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. There are so many parallels in this story, I think, from Nehemiah and us today. We live in what some have termed a post-Christian society, meaning that we have passed the time where our society was somewhat Christian. Our country was definitely founded on Christian principles. The founding fathers of our nation were predominantly Bible-believing Christian men, and you see that influence in our founding documents and in their letters and correspondence and things like that. If you look around and watch the news and see what's going on in the world around us today, I think that the case can definitely be made that we are a less Christian society than we once were. Certainly, if you compare us to compare now to say 70 years ago to the 1950s, where everyone went to church. It was just the thing to do. The church was kind of the social hub of every community. And if you didn't go to church, then you probably weren't going to get elected. Your business probably wasn't going to do well, and those type of things. And so the world has definitely changed around us. And churches everywhere, churches across the country are hurting in a lot of ways. Churches are closing their doors. Churches are, having to figure out different ways of doing things and cutting the budget and not seeing nearly as many people in their services and ministry becomes more difficult and just all the challenges that come with that. And so I think there are definitely some parallels in the work that Nehemiah set for himself and the remnant, the ones that were with him, is I think in a lot of ways similar to what Christianity has in front of us today. We have to rebuild the church, not because God doesn't protect the church or the church, the way we've done church was bad, but the way we've always done church isn't working anymore. And there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily biblical mandates that need to be changed. We can't change the things that are biblical. We've got to stand on Scripture and do things in the right way and make sure that we're faithful to God's call for the church. But at the same time, we are going to have to figure out new ways of moving forward in the world that we live in. It's like missionaries when we send missionaries to foreign countries. Before we send them, they have to spend months and months learning a new language, learning about the culture, and figuring out what it's like in that place, because they can't just go there and do things the way we do things. They've got to make the church work in that culture. And the great news is the gospel is universal, and Jesus died for all peoples, and so we can do that. But that's one of the things that if you go somewhere else, when we've been to Ecuador, I was recently I had a bunch of those pictures pop up in my time hop, and I remember there were those core things that were the same, but there were so many things about church in Ecuador that was different, and it worked in their culture. They just did things differently. And so I think our culture has changed, but the church hasn't changed with the culture. And in some ways that's good. We need to stand firm, like I said, in Scripture and doctrine and those things. But then there's a lot of other things that probably definitely could afford to be changed. I remember before I was the pastor, we had a different pastor at Addington, and I was the youth minister, and we were setting up for the Lord's Supper. And we were getting everything together, and the pastor and I were setting the table up and everything, and somebody came in and they started unfolding this white cloth, and the pastor said, "What's that for?" And this person said, "Well, we put this over the table until it's time to serve." And the pastor said, "Why do we do that?" And this person said, "Well, we just always have." And the pastor said, "Well, why don't we not this time? That's just an added step of something to have to do, and there's no biblical mandate for it. And honestly, it comes from a time where you had the churches weren't nearly as sealed up, and in the summertime in warm weather, you would open windows to get a breeze in there to make it more comfortable for folks. And as you know, when you open windows, in come the flies. And so, you needed to protect any kind of food that you were going to eat, anything you were putting in your mouth, you needed to protect from the flies. And so a lot of churches have done this, and a lot of churches still do this because, it's just a holdover from that. It had a practical purpose at one time, but, now with air conditioning and, we don't open windows, and, things are different. And so it doesn't have a practical purpose anymore. But this person wanted to do this because it's what we've always done. And, the pastor said, "Well, why don't we not?" And it was kind of a tense moment. This pastor was still pretty new because, well, the two pastors before me were always new. They didn't stay long enough to not be new. But anyway, it was, he was new, and there was this kind of tense moment, and so this person kind of folded the cloth up and set it to the side, and we go to Sunday school and do our regular thing, and the pastor and I walked back into the sanctuary, just not too long before the morning service, to get things ready to go, and the cloth was over the table. Some people, we just can't let go of some things, even though their practical purpose has expired. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think for the church to move into this new culture that we live in, we're in this culture. We're not of the world, but we're in the world, right? And so we're like missionaries, and we need to rebuild the church, and a lot of things about a lot of the way that we do things to match, or not match the culture, but to work in the culture. And I think that's going to be just pivotal in the life of this church to move forward, to move into the times that we live in, is to let go of some of those things that we've always done, just simply because we've always done them. That's a terrible reason to do something, is because we've always done them. I have, the time that I have pastored this church and been in leadership of this church, my litmus test has always been, is it biblical? Is it biblically mandated? If the Bible says that we have to do it or we should do it, then let's do it. If not, then that's negotiable. Let's figure out the best way to do that. And let's figure out a way that works in the community in which we do ministry. And so, I think that's going to be very important for this church moving forward, is figuring out how to, minister to the culture, minister to the community in which we do ministry, in which Addington Baptist Church exists. And so this morning we're going to look at Nehemiah chapter 4, and we're going to begin in verse 15. It says, when our enemies, this is Nehemiah speaking, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me. And I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, the work is great and widely spread, and we are separated on the wall far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there, our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night, and may labor by day. So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. What we see here is this idea of the sword and the trowel. Charles Spurgeon talked about this. He had a little periodical, kind of a magazine that he put out when he was alive and doing ministry, and that was the name of it, was the sword and the trowel. This idea of having a work implement in one hand, while at the same time, in the other hand, having a weapon to be able to defend yourself. Now, this was very practical for Nehemiah and the people that were working with him, because, again, the city of Jerusalem had no walls. That's what they were working on, was rebuilding the walls around the city to protect themselves. And since they didn't have walls, they were just easy picking for whoever wanted to attack them. And people would come in and attack the city and take what they wanted, and just do whatever they wanted to do. And they knew that this was a problem, and so they were working on what needed to happen. They knew they needed to they knew that they needed to have a wall. The problem is, they could have had a weapon in each hand. They could have all, stood guard. Nehemiah could have said, split them up into, 3 groups, and we're going to do 8-hour shifts, and, we're going to around the clock have guards so that, we can't be, so that we can't be attacked, or if we are attacked, we'll be able to defend ourselves. But the problem is, that's a short-term plan. That doesn't that doesn't help them in the long run. It doesn't help them long term, because that's going to have to continue forever, because you still don't have walls to protect yourself. At the same time, he could have said, all right, we're going to, everybody lay your swords down and let's get this wall built so that we can, have a wall to protect us, and, then we'll be protected. But the problem with that is now you're not defended, and, while the wall's still not built, these people can come in, knock down what you're building, kill whoever they want, carry off your, wives and children and your stuff and whatever. And so either one of these, to the exclusion of the other, is a mistake. Neither one of them is a long-term solution for the problem that they have. And we have a very similar situation in the church today and in Addington Baptist Church today. We have issues that need to be dealt with. We have things that need to be taken care of. But at the same time, we need to be looking out for one another. We need to be praying for one another. We need to be defending and ready to defend our church. We need to be ready to defend the faith and prepared to do spiritual warfare, to do battle. Jump forward into the New Testament and look at Ephesians chapter 6 and see the spiritual warfare that's taking place and how we can prepare ourselves for that spiritual warfare. And at the same time, we look at Nehemiah, and not only are we prepared for warfare, not only are we prepared to defend ourselves, but we need to be at work. We need to be doing something. And so, just real practically here, let me ask you a question. What is your part in the work of Addington Baptist Church? I'm assuming if you're watching this that you're a member of Addington Baptist Church. If you're not, if you're a member and you're going somewhere else, then just plug in your church where I say Addington Baptist Church. But what is your part in the work of Addington Baptist Church? And what I'm not saying is, what have you done? This is a trick that the enemy plays on us, and a way that he can get us to lay the trowel down is by saying, well, you've done enough. You did this, and this. You've worked hard for so long. You've, whatever. And, now it's time to rest. Now it's time for somebody else to step into that role, to take that burden or that place or whatever. Maybe it is time for somebody else to do that thing, but if it is, then it's time for you to do something else. You don't get to retire from Christianity, and you don't get to retire from the church. You get to retire when you wake up dead. That's the deal. As long as God gives you breath, then God's got something for you to do. And He's got something for you to do inside the church as part of the ministry of the church. That was one of the things that, for me, as Lindsay and I were, just praying about and thinking about, our decision to move on, was, one of the big things for me was God began to show me an area of ministry that I have a heart for, and I want to be a help in. And honestly, that is ministry to ministers. I have been very fortunate at Addington Baptist Church to have served just an amazing church. You guys have been so good to me. You've been patient with me. You've done what I've asked you to do. You've been good to me. And still, this pastoring is the loneliest job that I know of. Sitting in that chair, being in that position, nobody can understand what it's like until you've done it. And even honestly, as a youth minister, I didn't understand what it's like to be the guy, to have those decisions, to have, the burden of everyone else's burden, of feeling everyone else's pain, and you never put that down. And so, I know that, I understand that burden, and God began to really just build in me a desire to be a friend that understands, to at least a pastor and possibly multiple pastors, to kind of be a pastor to pastors, almost to be somebody that can be competent pulpit supply when that pastor wants to take vacation. That's a difficult thing to trust somebody with your pulpit. To ask somebody to come in and preach in your pulpit is a big deal, and pastors don't take that lightly. And that's one of the things that's difficult. Pastors feel like they need to be there every single Sunday, and that'll kill you. That will burn you out in just an unbelievable hurry. And there are just so many things, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but God began to show me another ministry that He was building in me, that He wanted me to do and be a part of. And so me moving on and leaving Addington Baptist Church is not leaving ministry. It's leaving vocational ministry, but I'm not retiring from ministry. I'm moving on to a different ministry that God has for me. And so what are you doing in this church? As long as God has you in this church, He has something for you to do. He has a purpose for you to fulfill. If you look at this, it goes on, it says, from that day on, half my servants worked on construction, and half held spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah. Everybody's got a place. Everybody's got a purpose. Everybody's got a job. And you need a job, not just something that you did, not just something that you do occasionally, but a regular job, a regular thing that it makes you go. I'm going to be honest with you. There have been days, there have been, many days, honestly, that, I got up and, went through my routine and went to church, not because I was, just real excited about doing it, but because I had a job. I had something that I needed to do. If I didn't do it, nobody else was going to. And so, having a job, having a thing that's yours, is a blessing, but it's also an accountability thing that keeps you coming back. So what are you doing at your church? And she is your church. This is the bride of Christ, but you're a part of it, and that means so much more than coming. Being there is step one, and that's important. And please keep coming as soon as we can again. But you need to do more than that. You need to be doing something in the church. You need to have a job in the church. Let me also say that don't kill yourself in the church. This has become my mantra. Chance and Hunter and John can tell you that I've told them multiple times, because of their leadership roles in the church. Don't burn yourself out on this, because it is super easy to do. Protect your family, and don't burn yourself out. But do something. Have a job. Have a purpose. Have something that's yours that you're doing in the church. And when I ask, what are you doing in the church? If you can't come up with something, if something doesn't leap to mind pretty quickly, if you have to sit and ponder on it for a while, you probably don't have a job. You probably don't have a function. Sadly, that puts you in the majority. That's the biggest group. But you don't have to live there. You don't have to be there. And everybody has a job. Everybody has gifts, and everybody has a way that they can help, a way that they can serve. The other thing I'm going to talk briefly about spiritual warfare. I have had the great gift at Addington Baptist Church of some absolutely amazing prayer warriors, some people that did battle for me every single day. There are people that I would get text messages from, or they would tell me on Sunday, or when they saw me or whatever. I pray for you every day, and I almost always say I know. Not one of those I know you don't have to tell me, but I know I feel it. one of the biggest things that you can do for your pastor, whoever your next pastor is to pray. Pray for him. Pray for his wife if he has one. Pray for his kids if he has kids. Pray for the family, for their protection. Go to battle for your pastor on your knees. Go to battle for the rest of the church leadership every single day. You guys are getting ready to move into a time of searching for a new pastor, and that's always a difficult time. And but it's also sometimes a lot of times it's a time that a church will look back on and say, man, God did some amazing things in us in that time. It's like when you talk to people, I remember my aunt years ago, I've told this story before, my aunt went through 2 rounds of breast cancer, and she had a scare after the second time, and I was talking to her on the phone, and I was, pretty upset. She really wasn't upset, and she said, Jason, I know I don't have cancer. And I was like, okay, it's a weird thing to say because the tests are saying that it looks like you might. She said, Satan isn't dumb enough to give me cancer again. And I was just dumbfounded because I didn't understand that. It seems like the kind of thing that Satan would absolutely do is give somebody cancer. And I really didn't know what to say. And so, she could tell from my silence that probably needed some more explanation. And she came back pretty quickly, and she said, when I went through chemo and treatments and all that stuff before, I got closer to God than I've ever been in my life. And that's the last thing in the world Satan wants. Satan's not dumb enough to give me cancer again. And, she was right. Turned out she didn't have cancer that time. Sometimes the things that can look the most daunting to us, sometimes the things that are scariest and the things that we least want to do are the things that God uses to grow us and to get us where he wants us to be. And I believe with everything in me that this time that this church is getting ready to move into is a time that you guys are going to grow. There are going to be some people step up and step into roles, leadership roles that they didn't know they could. And it's just going. I think it's going to be a time that I'm not saying it's going to be fun, but I believe that it's a time that you will look back on, that we will look back on and say, man, God did some absolutely amazing things in this church during that time. And so while it may be painful at times and it will certainly be uncomfortable, I think that it's going to be a good thing. And as you go through that, I want you to fight for each other. One of the most important things about a church is, we may, all churches, like any other group of people, have disagreements and things that, don't go the way we want them to and whatever. And it's kind of like siblings. I might fight with my sister, but you better not fight with my sister. You don't get to. I get to. I've earned that right. And so, we may have disagreements amongst ourselves. We may not, whatever. We may not always get along, but fight for each other. Look out for each other. Look for the best in each other. Don't be overly critical of one another. I'm not saying, that you ignore, immoral behavior or anything like that. But it's so easy to pick somebody else apart when they're doing something that nobody else is doing. That's one of the hard things about being the pastor and being a leader of any group, but especially the church, is it's easy for everybody else to sit back and see what's going on and see what that person's doing and be critical of it and say, well, I would have done this or whatever. Well, that's an easy thing to say, but you don't sit in this seat, and so. You don't know what's going on in someone else's life. You don't know, there are a lot of things that you don't know. And so I'm going to ask you to fight for each other, not with each other, because church, you don't have time to fight with each other. There's just not time for it. There's a very real enemy out there, and he will do anything and everything he can to destroy this church, to tear it down. And he doesn't need any help. He certainly doesn't need you doing his work for him. And so please, 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 if I can ask, if I can ask something of you, it would be to be kind to one another, to look out for one another, to pray for one another, pray with one another. Do battle for your church. Jesus, there's a passage in the New Testament. Jesus is talking with his disciples, and it's the passage where he gives Peter a new name. He asks Peter, who do they say that I am? Or he asked them, who do they say that I am? And they said, some say you're, Isaiah or one of the prophets or John the Baptist. And Jesus asked the question, I think the question. He says, who do you say that I am? And Peter, being Peter, man, he just jumps in there right off the bat, and he says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. And then he gives him a new name. He'd been called Simon up to that point. And he says, your new name's Peter, which is very close to the Latin for rock. And on this rock I will build my church, meaning the confession that Peter had just made. The church is built on the confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then he says something very important. He says, the very gates of hell shall not prevail against her. Church, we know how this ends. We don't know what happens between now and then. We don't know what's going to play out. I wish I could tell you. That's not true. I don't wish I could tell you. Because I think if we knew, we'd probably just lay down and quit. But not knowing, I don't know what's going to happen between now and then, but what I know is the very gates of hell can't prevail against the church. But that doesn't mean he's not going to try. And so you need to have your trowel in one hand doing the work of the church. The church needs you. Addington Baptist Church needs you. Yes, I'm talking to you. I don't care what you've done. I don't care what your mistakes are. I don't care what your past is. I don't care what your gifts are or aren't. Your church needs you, and they need your trowel. They need the tools of your trade, the tools of your gifts. Your church needs you. And in the other hand is the sword. In the other hand is the defense, ready to do war, ready to make war on Satan and his schemes and his lies and his tricks and all the things that he will bring against this church. You are the church. And you need to be building the wall, building this church into a church that ministers to the community in which it exists, missionaries in the places where you do life, doing the work of the church with the trowel, and with the sword in the other hand, doing battle, not with each other, but for each other. I believe so strongly. One of the most difficult things about my decision to move on was because for years and years and years I have said that church is a family that you belong to, not a place that you go to. And Addington Baptist Church has been a family that we have belonged to since before we were a family. Before Macy was born, we found Addington Baptist Church. God brought us Addington Baptist Church. We became a family there. And I did not want to leave. I didn't, I still don't. I love this church so much. But God made it very clear that it was time to move to a different ministry. It was time to move on. And that means that God's got the next man to fill the pulpit at Addington Baptist Church. I will be praying for him. I am already praying for him. I have been for a long time. I hope that you are already. If you're not, you need to start. And you need to be praying for the people who will be sitting around you. You need to be kind to one another, doing battle for one another, loving each other. Sword in one hand, trowel in the other, doing the work of the church, while fiercely making war on behalf of the kingdom. I love you. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I love this church. And I believe in her. I believe that God is going to do amazing things. I have said that for at least 10 years that I've been pastor. I believe with everything in me that this church is going to rebuild its walls. It's going to find new ways to do ministry. And God is going to do absolutely just mind-blowing, amazing things. Because that's what God does. And I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to hear the stories. I love you guys. Do more. Build a wall. I hope to see you next week. Have a good week.